management strategy, silvicultural practices, which allow the sustainable management of forest ecosystems in the face of changing conditions. She also teaches a lecture in a field silviculture class at the U of M and is the co-director for the first module of the National Advanced Silviculture Program. Please welcome.
So, can folks hear me without the microphone okay? Or my mic is like, no, please stand by the microphone. Okay, I will do my best. I am a wanderer when I talk, so I will, that's dangerous. Okay, I will now keep this with me. But if anyone also needs to get up at any point while I'm talking, please do. I know it can be a long time sitting in a seat, so if you need to move, please do that. I am so grateful to be here, and thank you, Karen, for that wonderful introduction. So while I am the person speaking, I am just one of so many individuals, so many organizations, so many sources of funding. And it's with that that I have extreme gratitude, humbleness, and privilege to talk about Crosby Farm and this long-term experiment. And someone earlier this week, I ran into them and they're like, oh my gosh, you're year 5 of a 20-year project. What does that feel like? And I was like, oh, that's amazing to think about 20 years. And that's just the start. And so I am just so, I could spend my whole 30 minutes acknowledging how much work this project takes, how many people this project takes. But that's not what Karen asked me to do. So I will not do that. So the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project is one of an international network with the goal of exploring how forest ecosystems are changing and being impacted by climate change, and how we can use intentional management, intentional decision-making to understand different treatments, different trade-offs, and different scenarios as we think about how and why and the decisions we make regarding our management and stewardship of these forested ecosystems. Crosby Farm is where we are at, and so we are one of the affiliate sites. We are the only urban site within this large network, and that's a really intentional choice because our forest ecosystems are across all kinds of different landscapes. And having worked in many different locations, I'm so grateful to be back in the Great Lakes, back in a region with water, because there is nothing more important, as I think from my time out west, than our relationship and that water and how lucky we are to be here. And so taking us just slightly outside this room along the Mississippi River, I want to take us to Crosby Farm and take us to this special place. And so, like most of you know in this room, emerald ash borer has hugely impacted our ecosystem. And at Crosby Farm, in some of those areas, that was over 95% of the overstory trees were impacted by emerald ash borer. And so huge change. And so on one of those pictures, you're seeing that loss of the overstory and the cucumber. That was a banner year for cucumber. And that was before our first frost. So you're seeing the mortality in the overstory. You're seeing that cucumber come in there. And after that frost, it really did look like a haunted house out there. And with that, as we think of the impact of EAB, it's not only the loss of an overstory, we really get concerned when we're not seeing that regeneration and recruitment. So we're seeing a big shift. And shifts happen in forest, shifts, disturbance, all those pieces are part of our forest ecosystems. But where we get concerned is when we don't see a change that allows future overstory trees to come into those places. And so while we may have millions, and that's not an understatement, millions of silver maple seedlings coming in every year, those seedlings aren't moving from these newly established germinants into a sapling or into an overstory tree. And so through this network, through the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network, one of the main overarching goals is that this is a science management partnership. So we come together for a 2.5 day workshop. So this was pre-COVID, 2.5 days we spent together, we talked together, we were in the field together, and that really set us up to think about and hear and understand how each of us come together to know the floodplain forest, what that looks like, how we consider values, how we consider management, all those pieces. And from that, the big pieces that came apart was the biggest management question was what do I regenerate? What am I planting? What am I thinking about? How do I do this? And from a research side, these were really unknown. Floodplains are understudied areas. So I'm a forester. I was trained as a forester. A lot of our background in Western science relates to commercial forest products. And so floodplains, while hugely, like, again, water, everyone needs water. That was not a commercial product in terms of the timber. And so these systems were understudied from how we understand them, from basic regeneration to how they grow, to how they function, to all these pieces. And so that was a really big question. How do we regenerate and how are these species responding? And so from those questions, we really designed this experiment that's based on resistance, resilience, and transition. So resistance, thinking about these impacts of climate change are coming. How do we kind of push back as much as we can? How do we keep what we can? Resilience, thinking about that flexibility or that bounce back like a rubber band. And that transition, acknowledging change is going to happen. Our forests are going to look different. How do we assist? How do we steward? How do we think about what that next step is for our forest? And so we did this focusing on regeneration. And so in our resistant plots, these are from when we designed this, our USDA zones that the Twin Cities were. We know that's now changed already within our time of our experiment. So we're no longer USDA A4 in the Twin Cities. We've shifted that. So resistance is USDA zone 4, silver maple, American elm, cottonwood, river birch, and hackberry. So these are species that were in Crosby Farm or the surrounding floodplain forest of the area. Our resilience, we moved slightly farther south, and this is where we were looking at floodplain forests of northern Iowa, southern Wisconsin, kind of this broader floodplain ecosystem. So, and looking at that southern seed zone, so zone 5. So we have silver maple, American elm, cottonwood, river birch, black willow, swamp white oak, American sycamore, fir oak, and then also to keep this as like our understanding of how these sites are functioning, given how dynamic floodplains are. In each plot, we have silver maple from zone 4. So that kind of serves as a tree to understand, okay, how is silver maple doing in this plot compared to another? And how can we use that information to understand and interpret our results? And you'll note American sycamore is bolded because while it's not generally found in those floodplain forests of Iowa, it's such a common tree species that has been planted in so many of our Midwestern urban forests that we considered it part of those ecosystems. So you'll notice like our flexibility, there's some flexibility in how we interpreted some of this. And then I should note American elm in both of these is elm disease resistant elm. So this is Dutch elm resistant elm. And then finally, transition, which is that biggest shift. So our predictions are that we're going to look a lot more like the northern portion of the southern bottomland. So that Missouri area. And so Missouri, southern Illinois. So starting to really look south. And so these are from zone 6. So we have silver maple, river birch, red maple, American sycamore, tulip poplar, pin oak, pecan, sweet gum, and finally our silver maple from zone 4. I have a handout if anyone wants nursery, anyone wants pricing information, anyone wants anything on that. I have a handout with that, as well as like survival and height growth. So got 30 copies, come see me. I can also email information too. And so we are so grateful that as we think about these species and we think about this experiment is not just displayed in words, it's displayed through artwork, through knowledge, through the artist Willard Mailbear and his depiction, his understanding, his knowledge, his artwork, and what that brings to how we think about this experiment. And so silviculture really is this art and science, and it's incorporating all these pieces of how we understand this. And so as I move into like what we're seeing on the plots, I really want to start with how we see this in so many different ways. And so looking at the plots, this was really intentional. So I'm gonna really get to walk over here. Okay, so these kind of outlines over here, those were all areas of ash mortality. So huge, basically 100% mortality in all of these outlined areas. And we have 3 different zones, zone A, B, and C, and that was really related to distance from both water bodies. So how that water relates to the flooding, how that relates to elevation, and really just trying to gain a better understanding of that. And so this is, again, another example of what that looks like. And so as part of this experiment, it's a replicated scientific experiment. It's also an experiment that's within Crosby Farm, where there's 500,000 visitors, 1 million visitors, a lot of people, 500,000, perfect. Thanks, Karen. And there's a path, and there's an intentional choice to make sure that our plots, our experiment was visible and that it wasn't hidden. Often when I do research, my research are in these forests that are in extensive areas, are difficult to access, are not available. And the goal of this was that if we want to think about climate change, it's not just me, it's not just you, it's all of us thinking about this together. So all those people walking, all those people part of this is part of their life too, their story, their piece. And so if we can give this an opportunity for conversation, that's huge. And I'll note, like, with that many visitors, we've had no impacts from human damage on any part of this experiment. If you remember that map with those extensive forest areas, other colleagues cannot say that. Yeah, I feel like that's like a mic drop moment there. Like, and it off, like when I'm presenting at forestry conferences, it really is an opportunity to acknowledge like how much work and how much gratitude I have being able to work with so many amazing partners, because we could not do this without the number of partnership and the number of support. And so within each of those areas, we have a 10th acre plot where each tree was intentionally planted in a location. So it's exactly 10 feet from its neighbor. They're all fenced and they're all protected. So those folks working in these systems know deer in these systems in floodplain are a different type of deer. They are, I have seen deer eat things that I'm like, I didn't think you would like that, but I guess that's good for you. Great. And so these are all fenced to protect them, to give them the best chance to get into that overstory. And so through a huge amount of work from the Minnesota, Iowa Conservation Corps, all the plots were cleared. They were then fenced and planted. And so this planting, we ordered seedlings before COVID hit. COVID hit in February. And through a lot of conversations. We talked about, okay, it's the right thing to plant. The river is low that year. It's May. It's an opportunity for people to be outside, to come together to do this. The day before we were scheduled to start planting, George Floyd was murdered. And it was an intentional conversation to continue the planting because people wanted to be here. So all of these trees were planted by volunteers. We modified how the planting was happening with COVID, with city lockdown, with all of those pieces, but people wanted to be here and needed to be there planting. And so it's a really important context to our story of how COVID, how the murder of George Floyd really was part of this planting. We were planting with volunteers. Everything was aimed at large stocks, so greater than 6 foot tall. And those seedlings that were coming from Zone 6, those were coming on train. So those came from trains in Missouri through COVID, and we'll talk about that later. And the big thing was, if we plant big trees, can we get them above the water? So if we do have a flood the next year, can they be big enough to survive that flood? And so they're planted on this 10 by 10 spacing, and every tree was marked. And it was amazing to see that with volunteers and volunteers that were often rotating, 98% of trees were planted in the right location and well done. We have continuous temperature monitoring, weekly phenology monitoring, so how these trees are responding. So this year in 2023, we ended phenology in November. In 2024, we started phenology again in February. So it's been a very short year that we've not been monitoring these trees. We also have annual survival, growth, and condition. Basically, how these trees are going, like a checkup, how they're growing, how we understand them, what they're looking like. And to do all of this, to maintain this experiment, requires hours of volunteer work to upkeep the plots, to maintain the fencing. So all those plots, we just removed trees within the plot. That was what was allowed. That meant all around the plots was still dead ash. So those dead ash have been continuously following. And we just last year were able to remove additional ones, which was great. But it's only through huge amounts of effort that we're able to maintain the integrity of the experiment. And so let's talk about some survival. So our first year, we've got resistance in green, resilience in blue, and transition in yellow. And we did a lot of work to check in on how they were doing that first year, because if a seedling is going to die, especially a planted one, it's often that first year. And so you'll notice we moved from May, July, September, the resistance and resilience, we saw some of those trees kind of bounce back, something that during that first measurement, we couldn't tell if they were alive or not. But by July and September, great, they came back looking good, alive. We see a little bit of that bounce back in that transition, but that one had the lowest survival. And really, most of those trees that were dead were likely dead when they were planted. So they had such a harsh journey, and the seed stock, it was either a seed stock or source stock or the journey, but those trees were likely dead when they were planted and not a result of planting error. Looking at the 3-year survival, so we see resistance, resilience, and transition really holding strong. We did do a replanting of some of our transition species to kind of bolster up our numbers and also maintain that diversity of the experiment. And we got back up to 76 and 73. So by year 3, we're looking at over 85% survival in our resistance and transition, or resistance and resilience, and our transition right around 73. These are really, really good numbers. Often when I talk to folks along floodplain forests, they're happy if they're getting greater than 50% survival. So we are really excited that we're seeing this survival. We're also looking at this, of course, by species. So seeing our silver maple that's in zone 4 and being able to see, we're seeing some of that plot level difference come out. And so this is helpful as we think about interpretation of our results. So this is just zone 4 silver maple. And we're seeing in the resistance and resilience, really high survival, close to 100%. We see a little bit better survival when we're looking at that zone 5 and zone 6, which is really interesting to consider. What does that mean in terms of climate change? What does that mean in terms of opportunity? What we think or an opportunity is like silver maple across all 4 zones survives really well. And so depending on your organization, depending on your level of risk, you have options. And you have options for where that seed source is coming from to see survival, high survival for the species. We also saw in our resistance, resilience, and transition treatments, species across all the different zones having opportunities and high survival. So seeing that in each of these areas, there are species that had over 90% survival. Again, this is an opportunity to think about, there are options and there are opportunities to think about what those species may be, how you might use this information, and how that kind of fits into your management plan or your consideration of those species. And I'll pull out some growth information, but both our resistance and resilience overall, really, really great survival. And sadly, one of the species that has been struggling more is cottonwood in both the resistance and resilience. And cottonwood has struggled because of some dieback issues, but also we've had some rodents coming in. And so they've been able to girdle the cottonwood, and each year then the cottonwood resprouts. And so that's been something that for many of the cottonwoods, we've seen that impact. There are still a few that are doing great and moving into that canopy, but that's a species that we've really seen multiple layers of impact for that species. And if we want to think about intentional management of cottonwood, probably have to consider additional kind of how we do that. Our transition has the most variable, so you'll see everything from 12% upwards to 98%, so a huge range of variability. And so this is a huge graph. We'll walk through it, but really it's starting to get at that height growth. So we have the different falls, fall 2020, fall 2021, and fall 2022, and it's a stacked bar chart. So it's adding on each year of growth there. So the lightest color is that first year of growth, that second darkest color is the second year of growth, and that darkest color is that third year of growth. And the goal is with adding the stacked bar chart is to give a context for how different species are growing. And so let me move to the next slide, which should start pulling some things out. And we also have, this is by the, on average, by the different plots. I also have this by species in a handout too. So we have 24 different plots, and these are the average level of growths. And as we look at some of these first ones, really wanting to highlight, these are often this is ordered in our resistant plots. So seeing this really consistent level of growth and seeing, even with our transition, we see areas of really high growth. And so, of course, these are our first 3-year results. We finished collecting data our 4th year and have already started collecting data for our 5th year. And I want to, we can't talk about this without talking about the flood of last year and that impact. And so, well, we haven't formally completed analysis yet. We noticed that our plots, when we were able to get in there, had water levels noted at 3.5 feet on average, but some plots had over 6.5 feet. And so one of our plots acted as a fishing net, and we had a fish caught in it. So that was something we did not expect to have with our plots, with our fencing, but it's something we are noting now in the future. But there is huge, huge connection across the water bodies. And so when we were able to get in there, 2023 post-flood check, we saw still really good survival for a lot of species. We saw these species be able to rebound. We saw these species be able to continue surviving. American elm, 100% survival, right? Amazing. Areas where we're seeing higher mortality with our sweet gum and our tulip poplar, those are kind of consistent with some of what we were seeing with some seed stock issues. We're going to be digging into those 4-year results and our 5-year results this year, but we're really hopeful for what we're seeing. And I think the big thing that we're going to be talking about next is thinking about intentional management as we move into these larger size classes. And so, big takeaway, trees are surviving across so many of these different zones. There are options, there are species combinations. And like I said, 2023 measurements ended in November, and 2024 measurements started in February. So this is February 5th. This is one of our tulip poplars that's debating on what it wants to do. It's had a few impacts of those nice frost dates. So, but as we kind of move into this next month, we're really going to be seeing how those species, especially with the water we've gotten, how those species respond and what that looks like as we continue to meet those growing degree thresholds. So thank you, and just continued gratitude. And there's time for questions. Super welcome those. Also, I've got handouts, and please feel free to ask questions throughout while I'm here.
On your mortality, how much of it was winter kill? I've tried yellow poplars for years and they live 3 or 4 and then winter kill.
So we haven't noticed a huge amount of winter kill, but we've also not had cold winters. So that's a big caveat too. And as we think about future plantings or future expansions, or like scenario B in this, so much of how we understand this experiment is based on the year that it was planted. And so the vulnerability is highest those early years, like you mentioned. And so we had really mild winters and also pretty low water levels. Like, it wasn't until last year, so 4 years after planting, that these seedlings experienced a flood. And at that point, they weren't even seedlings. They were 10, 12 foot, 15 foot tall trees. And so I think that is a big question and a big kind of caveat, especially with floodplain, is so much of how we understand regeneration is based on those first year or two after we plant them. And so I think that's maybe where we're going next, is if we see some of these species, can we replicate this again and see similar results, or working with you all that are planting these, seeing if you're seeing the same things and how that relates to the year that you're planting or the season that you're planting.
Hi. Oh God, it's loud. Okay. I am so glad to finally put together
Marcella, that you're the person planning this experiment. Okay, is that better? Okay, cool. Okay, my question isn't so much about the experiment, but kind of about like I don't know, the implications of this. I just have like a gut reaction sort of against some of the non-native species and, in the sense that they don't belong. And I feel uncomfortable, like thinking of our floodplains being repopulated with tulip poplars or things like that. And just curious for you personally, like, I don't know how you're thinking about that dimension of this work.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it's one that relates to a lot of aspects of values and backgrounds, and especially depending on the organization you're working for, or it brings brings people into how we think about that. And it's one that so climate change is changing things. And that is 100% our reality and where we're going. And so my view is I would like folks to have as many options as they can on the table that allow people to be able to make decisions that provide opportunity. And so, and the other piece is, we as people have been moving species around for a very long time. And so, that movement does not come without consideration. And especially now that we live in a global society, that movement is a global movement. And we've seen how that global movement can really cause a lot of impact and a lot of change. But there's been intentional movement of species at a lot of different times. And so I think it's more thinking about, when I think about these species, I think about how do we, again, give options. And these options might not be for everyone, but you can assess the trade-offs, you can assess level of acceptability, you can assess values, because that's what management or stewardship is. It's linking the ecology, it's linking our understanding of systems, but that's only part of it. It's linking with who we are and our acceptability and our values and all those pieces. And so I guess that's my complicated answer to, if we have options, we can hopefully maintain functional ecosystems that allow us to provide the services, the values, the function of what this forest is. And there were intentional choices too. So bald cypress was on the table, but we knew adding a conifer tree would really shift what this system is in terms of how a place feels. And so that was not a species that we wanted to bring into that system, especially given some of the history of some of the other pine species that were planted. So we intentionally did not bring a species in that could have been part of the experiment. But thanks for that question. It's a great one.
Hi, I'm wondering if you do any like management in the plots for other invasive species or?
Yeah, I did not mention that. So every year we measure understory vegetation as well as regeneration by seed or suckering. So we're looking for that natural regeneration in our control plots. So those treatments have had the overstory removal and no planting. We're unfortunately not seeing regeneration happening in those plots, but we're also recording that in all the plots. And then for those who have worked with nettle and other species, we do mow and do weed control, because with the weekly phenology measurements, and especially those by volunteers, by student groups, by the number of people that are in there. We reduce the nettles so that folks can be in those plots and be more comfortable to be able to be part of the science.
Hey, question about moving into larger size classes. You said there was maybe some intentional management that was going to take place as the trees get larger. And also with moving into larger size classes, they're probably moving more into sexual maturity and seed maturity. Are we looking at trees moving out of the plots soon?
Trees, so they'll always be part of a plot. That's something that's on the radar, is thinking about the removal of the fencing, if and when, and what does that look at? But yeah, we're probably going to need to start talking about intentional management. So these trees were planted on a 10 by 10 spacing. So their canopies are starting to touch, and that means they're starting to have competition. So, and that's going to be a conversation of the trees are either going to decide who's going to be suppressed and who dies, or there's going to be some intentional conversation about that. And both options are okay. It's just having a decision relates to the actions that we take. And so I don't think any of us, when we started planting on a 10 by 10 foot spacing, would have ever guessed we would have had the level of survival that we did. Otherwise, we would have planted a little wider, but we got lucky. We got really, really lucky.
Okay, if there's no other questions, we have a little bit of time as they're still setting lunch up. Thank you so much, Marcella. Really appreciate your presentation.